I am going to talk about patents, which is something that I've been writing about for the past couple of years. But on a sort of more meta scale, I'm going to talk about why I started writing about psychedelic patents. I am a science journalist and a mental health reporter. My interest in psychedelics had nothing to do with law at all. And if I had my way, I would never read a patent because they're very long, boring documents. I love reading scientific papers and I love reading about the neuroscience and culture and philosophy of psychedelics. And so this was not intentional for me to spend so much of my time thinking about patents. And so I'm going to explain a little bit about why. And I think that'll also help explain why I think it's important we need to keep talking about patents and why the psychedelic community can maybe be like a real good influence on patent reform more generally. Also, just a note that my perspective is quite American because that's where I live. I'm based in New York. So a lot of this stuff has to do with the US Patent and Trademark Office. But I think that's very important just for psychedelics in general, since that's a huge place where we're looking for FDA approval and where the medical model is going to be, setting examples and standards for the rest of the world. Yeah. So this is the first article that I wrote about psychedelic patents. The reason that I found out about Compass Pathways patent application, which is this patent right here, is that I saw a tweet from a patent lawyer named Graham Pachenik on Twitter where he outlined that some of the claims in the patents included the description of how psychedelic assisted therapy would happen. And so these include claims on things like the room having soft furniture, the therapist holding the patient's hand. And in this tweet, he posed the question, if a patent like this got approved, would this mean that a company could sue somebody for doing just like the very basic components of psychedelic therapy? So again, this is a psychedelic patent application. It was never approved, and it has to do with Compass's specific form of psilocybin called polymorph A. So there's some caveats about the kind of enforcement that this patent would have. But for me, it was kind of a wake-up call that there were going to be sort of like secret rules around ownership around psychedelic medicine that people weren't really aware of and that I hadn't been thinking about at all. And I had been really concerned about access and what things were going to cost. And if you live in the US, you know that drug prices are crazy high and patents have a role in that. But I hadn't put two and two together that people were going to file a bunch of patents on psychedelics. I probably should have, but this was my first wake up call to that, and seeing kind of the details of the claims and how far the ownership could go. It made me just start to realize like I need to start learning about patent law because I don't really know anything about it. And what I started to learn was that there were lots of patents being filed. I found something called on Psychedelic Alpha, they have patent trackers. And so you can look for every single psychedelic molecule and see all of the patents that are being filed and patents that have been approved. And this was in 2021, so a couple years ago. There were dozens of patents being applied for by Philip Morris for e-cigarettes, for periodontal disease, hair loss, weight loss, food allergies, and people had just been filing these as the research was ongoing for mental health issues, but patents were being filed for almost everything under the sun. And again, I didn't really know what that meant, and I didn't know what it meant for research or for access later or for cost. And so it was something that I felt was like a real gap in my knowledge covering psychedelics as a potential mental health intervention or for other indications down the line. So this data is also taken from the patent trackers. It's a little outdated. It's from 2022. And so you can see that even though there were patents that were filed in the first stage of psychedelic research, in the 60s and 70s, this number is increasing a lot. And there's a lot of patent applications that we don't know about because they're kept secret for 18 months. And so we can only imagine that these numbers are going higher and higher. So again, this is a couple years ago. This was when I first started writing about the Compass patents. It started a lot of sort of like conversation and some outrage. Like, how can you file a patent on psilocybin or psychedelic assisted therapy? We all know what the process is. How can somebody own this? And so this was a discussion between Christian Angermeyer and Tim Ferriss, where they were discussing what patents are and what they should be used for. And so Tim Ferriss was concerned about access and cost down the line. And Christian Angermeyer, who is part of Atai Life Sciences and a funder of Compass, was saying you need patents in order to fund research. Like that is what pays for the clinical trials. That is what gets investors to give money to them. And he's right about that. That is the way that biotech works. And so I think, again, going back to a couple of years ago, and when I first started thinking about this, there was a lot of, I think, moral outrage at just the idea of ownership. And then the pushback was, well, this is the way biotech works. And if you want the psychedelic industry to be part of the modern biotech industry, we have to do this. And patents drive innovation, and end of the story. So since then, I have started thinking a lot about what patents are for and this notion that they drive and incentivize innovation. And what I learned is that there's actually a long history of people disagreeing about that and whether or not patents really incentivize innovation or there are cases in which they can actually put stopgaps on it. So here's a couple of very old examples. This is James Watt. He is an inventor of the steam engine, and he used a patent from 1769 to fight all competition, and he completely suppressed the advancement of steam engines for about 31 years while he held the patent. And similarly, the Wright brothers had a patent in 1906 on their flying machine. They were extremely litigious. They sued anybody who tried to make advancements on the airplane. And because of this, during World War I, the US aviation industry lagged so far behind everywhere else that we had to use European planes because our planes were so bad because the Wright brothers were just holding on to their patents. Much more recently, again, if you live in the United States, you know that the pharmaceutical industry abuses patents. This is something that we know. There are patent academics who I have had the privilege of interviewing who know nothing about psychedelics, who are interested to hear from me about patents entering the space, who have studied this for decades. Robin Feldman on the right has studied what she calls negative innovation, which is when pharmaceutical companies pursue drugs or dosages because they're patentable, but not because they're necessarily the best for patients. And then Colleen Chen is she works with the US Patent and Trademark Office, but she studies the relationship between inequality and patents. And part of her argument is that, again, the patent system is kind of like this secret code or secret rule book that if you have money and you have the ability to pay lawyers with lots of money, you can suddenly know how this rule book works and you can file patents and have ownership over things and you can sue people for years and years. But you really only can do that if you have the resources to do so. So the patent system comes with a lot of privilege of knowing the rules to it and being able to use the cogs in its machine, and that takes a lot of resources. So in healthcare, we haven't seen the patent system always work in patients' favor. And there's a nonprofit called IMAC, which has directly tied patents on some of the most used drugs in the US to their costs. And so there's a lot of data on this. 78% of drugs that are associated with new patents between 2005 and 2015 were not actually new. This is a process called evergreening that the pharmaceutical industry uses, where they just extend their patent protection beyond the 20 years that it's supposed to allow, and they make a very tiny change, and then they can get a patent on it again for the next 20 years. So the top 12 money-making drugs in the United States, there's over 125 patents filed on just those 12 drugs, and there's 71 granted patents per drug. So again, from the US perspective, this means that our drugs cost a lot of money, and patents are one of the reasons why. And because we have no national healthcare system and people are dealing with Medicaid and private insurance, it leads to our healthcare being really, really expensive. And there's also been research that shows that when there are a lot of patents in a space, investors will sometimes stop giving money into that space because they're worried about being able to get a return on investment on that specific field of research. So again, bringing this back to psychedelics, when I started to learn about patent practices in other industries, and as a health reporter, I'd been aware of this before, I started wondering if this was going to happen in psychedelics too. Obviously, I want research to be funded as well. And I don't think that psychedelics should be an industry that says, well, we'll just never file for patents because that's unreasonable. But we already, in my reporting, I started to see that these same practices of filing for as broad of patents as possible, doing patents not just to incentivize research, but to exclude other parties was already a tactic that was starting to be used. So this is from a couple years ago. This was some audio that was leaked to me from an investor meeting between Compass and Atai, where Christian Angermeyer is discussing the strategy of making a patent as broad as possible, instructing the lawyers to do so. Again, this is you have the millions of dollars to pay lawyers to do exactly this. Similarly, this was an email that was leaked to me, which is talking about how there will never be other products brought to market because they will hit the patents of Compass and Atai. And I just want to say briefly that I've written about lots of other companies besides Compass and Atai. It's just that Compass is one of the companies that is closest to FDA approval for psilocybin assisted therapy. And so they are just the company that's been in the spotlight. I think that's a tiny bit unfair because these patent practices are not unique to them and we could see them much more widespread. But as a reporter, you kind of have to work with what people leak to you. So this is just what we ended up getting. And this was a couple years ago. But it highlights that these patent approaches that have existed in other fields, the psychedelic industry is not immune to them. Like we will start seeing them more and more within psychedelics too. So why should we care about this? There have been people who suggested that worrying about patents is not that important. And again, like they exist to generate money and we need money. And so we should just operate as usual and let the psychedelic industry run as biotech and pharma has always run. That is essentially what Hamilton Morris said about my work at Wonderland in Miami last fall. And I just think it's a kind of uncreative position because I think there's a lot that we can do with patents without being anti-patent. I think that patents are a tool. They are, in the United States, a right protected by the Constitution. And they are an amazing tool to generate money for the things that we care about researching about. And so what I've tried to do in my reporting on patents is not just be anti-patent, but think about the ways that we can educate the psychedelic community about how patents can be used for good and for bad. Because I think patent law is not like the most sexy or exciting topic. And a lot of people don't know that there's some wiggle room in how patents are used and that the public actually has a lot of power in terms of speaking up against bad patents before they are granted. There's like a window where people can file like submissions and say that a patent violates prior art or like there's been evidence of that same thing before. There's ways that the public can get involved before patents are granted, because once a patent is granted after a certain period, it takes a lot of money and effort to get it taken away, and then somebody has ownership over something. And I think just the knowledge about how the patent system works is a huge resource and asset. And when I started to learn about it, it was incredibly rewarding because then I felt like I actually had the expertise to say, you know, I think that's a problematic patent, and I could say why. So for example, this was an article that I wrote a couple years ago, and it's about prophetic patents. And this is a great example because this is something that I never knew existed. And once I knew it existed, I felt like I really had the ability to speak up against cases like this. So a prophetic patent is when you file a patent on something that you've never done before. You've never done research on it, and you're not actually sure if it will work. So you're prophesizing that it can be a thing. And so somebody has this patent now on LSD for food allergies without doing any study on this, and now owns the application of LSD for food allergies. So that means a couple things. Let's say somebody wanted to test LSD for food allergies and wanted to start a company and was looking for funding. They might not get funding because somebody already owns this. And they may do this or they may not. It may just be something that they hold ownership over. They may sue, they may not sue, but it could prevent somebody from getting research dollars who's actually intending on doing this research. And it may be tricky for them because somebody has just decided to file a patent on it. And even the fact that you can get a patent on something that you've never done. So I read this patent, and in the description, it's just, here's what I could do, but then didn't actually do it. And then the person who owns this patent is not really in the psychedelic industry. It just kind of seemed like something that they tried to get and then got. So this is, prophetic examples are a great way for us to think about, like, what are the ways in which psychedelic patents might actually stop research from happening and like stop funding from going into a specific area. This is an example here's Graham again, who is talking about somebody who got a patent for a DMT vape pen. So somebody owns this now according to the patent system. And this is something that's not new at all. I think there's been many, many cases, even published online, about people using vape pens to take DMT. And this was a really great example of how the US Patent and Trademark Office is not good at looking for prior art within psychedelics. So prior art is when they assess if something is new and should be patentable by searching if it's been done before. And usually the way they do that is they search for patents. So they search the patent database to see if somebody has patented it before. And if they haven't, then it's considered novel. But of course, because of psychedelics legal status, most of the inventions in the psychedelic community are they're not in the patent database. They're not even necessarily in PubMed. They might not even be necessarily on the internet, because why would you publish directions for something that's illegal? These are things that are passed through word of mouth, through online community boards, maybe, but they're not things that patent examiners are looking at. So this is a really good example, again, not anti-patent, but showing how some of these patents can be granted just because of these flaws with how the patent system works. On the right, you can see that you can see exactly what the patent examiner searched for, and they searched in this case for about 7 minutes, and they didn't search for DMT or vape pen. Instead, they just looked for prior patents on this and didn't find anything and granted the patent. So, let's say somebody wanted to make a DMT vape pen with some new technology and administer it someday. Now this person owns this. It might be hard to get funding on it, or really they're owning something that is not novel. And according to patent law, you shouldn't be able to do that. Another really big question is about some of the academic research that's been ongoing that those researchers have not filed any patents on. Can companies just come in and swoop in and patent their ideas that they've been working on, for decades sometimes, or for years? This has happened many, many times. I wrote about just this one case of people who had been working on ways to synthesize psilocybin using bioengineered E. coli. And then a company patented something very similar, and they felt like, we already did this before. We just didn't patent it because we wanted this to be open science. We wanted other people to be able to do this, and we wanted to be able to make psilocybin in high doses through these bioengineered bacteria. That's a really cool idea. And so we intentionally didn't create ownership around it. But now somebody else owns this idea, and they could even sue us potentially for doing it, even though we came first. So this again, I think, is going to come up more and more as the industry continues to grow and people come in from the outside and are trying to get ownership over things. And so I think it's it's like the kind of thing that requires understanding of how the patent system works in order for us to be able to assess each of these cases on their merits and who should really have the rights to own what things. Another really instructive example from just the last year was the challenge against Compass Pathways patent on polymorph A, which is their synthetic form of psilocybin. And this, again, is an example that's not about Compass, but about the resources that it takes to challenge a patent once it's already been granted. So there was a nonprofit called Freedom to Operate, which did their own independent research. They did very extensive crystallography research on different forms of crystal structures of psilocybin. They submitted filings to the patent office that argued that Compass's polymorph wasn't new, that it had existed before. The judges denied their filing. The whole thing took about, over a year and almost $1 million. And in the end, sort of nothing changed. And then the money just sort of vanished into the ether. And this is a field where we have limited resources right now. And once patents are granted, they're very expensive to challenge. And we're only going to see this more and more. People are going to start suing each other. They're going to sue each other for patent infringement. This happens in every other field. And so there's going to be an incredible use of money and resources dedicated to this. And I just think it's important for us to think about why and what are the cases in which that's the best use of our money. So I think all of this comes down to the patent system and not necessarily psychedelics, because all of the abuses that the patent system allows have existed long before there was such a thing as psychedelic business or the psychedelic industry as we know it today. But things like evergreening and patent thicketing and the connection of patent to high drug prices, all of these are abuses that the patent system has allowed the pharmaceutical industry to do. And so I think that we shouldn't just assume that the psychedelic industry is going to be immune to those same abuses, because it's really the system that allows it. And there's going to be somebody who's going to take advantage of it. There's something called patent trolling, which is when basically it's sort of like the LSD for food allergy thing, where you file a patent and you never intend to do anything with your invention, but basically you're just going to go around suing other people, and that's how you make your money. Or there's a lot of new companies right now that are not going to make it. What they could do is sell their patents to patent trolls, and then the patent trolls will go around just enforcing their patents. And this happens all the time in other industries, and we're still so new in the psychedelic industry that it's very possible and very likely that it'll happen in psychedelics too. So what does that mean? I mean, it's such early days that when I first started writing about patents, I think there was just this curiosity gap of like, can we even file patents on psychedelics? Like, you shouldn't be able to do that. And now it's like, okay, obviously you can. And there are cases in which they're really valuable, and these small companies really need them in order to get funding. And it really comes down to that. It comes down to money. And it's important to mention that one of the reasons that psychedelics is so reliant on like venture capital money is because of the huge gap in government funding on research. That's a huge part of the story, that psychedelics have relied on both philanthropy and then just private industry without very little in the middle, especially in the US, like funding from NIH or NIMH. So that's a huge part of this. But I've also started to see a more creative approach to both financial structures for funding research and also alternative ways to using patents. And this is where I think that the psychedelics community could inform patent use overall, rather than just using patents as exclusionary tools and ways to like create monopoly pricing. There are things like patent pools and patent pledges and ways to structure clinical designs around generic molecules that end up paying for themselves because of the cost difference between a patented molecule and the generic. And I wrote this quite long article recently about ways to use the patent system and the current healthcare financial models that won't negatively affect patients down the line in terms of cost or in terms of monopoly and ownership. And I think that this is, again, like the creativity and innovation that the psychedelics community wants to bring to mental health care is something that they could equally bring to patent law. And that really excites me. And I also think that in the United States and elsewhere, if people who are invested in psychedelics becoming decriminalized or legalized, the patent system is not necessarily going to work in a future where people can access psychedelics through other means, like through legal means, because there's not going to be monopoly pricing is not going to work if you can just go and like in Oregon and go to an adult service center instead, or just like take mushrooms with your friends and not worry about being criminalized for it. That's a really good thing to have all of these different options available to us for access, but it means that these typical models for return on investment might not work. And so the patent system as we know it for biotech may not even apply here. So I think it's time to really start thinking creatively about patents, not as good or bad or evil, but just as ways that we can ensure equitable access for everybody. Yeah, and I'm done.